A man browsing an antique shop discovered an old leather-bound journal with his initials on it. Curious, he flipped through it and froze when he saw the entries. The journal described his childhood, his family, and even small details of his daily life, but the handwriting was not his. The last entry read, "I will find this book one day, and I won't know how I wrote it." In the 1980s, a film enthusiast found a VHS copy of a sci-fi movie that didn't exist. The actors were real, but no record of the film could be found anywhere. Years later, a major studio announced the production of a brand new sci-fi film. When it was released, it was identical to the mysterious VHS scene for scene, line for line. Even the actors were shocked as they had never worked on the earlier version. A group of researchers was given permission to explore an abandoned mansion known for its strange history. They carefully mapped out the layout, noting each room's size and location. A week later, when they returned, some of the rooms had changed. Hallways led to new doors. Entire sections of the house had rearranged, and one staircase now led to a blank wall. During the filming of a historical drama, an actor was assigned a minor role as a background extra, but when the film was released, he was shocked to see himself delivering an entire monologue, a scene he never filmed. Even more unsettling, his character's name wasn't in the script. None of the other actors remembered filming with him, and the director insisted that the footage had never been shot. Librarians in different parts of the world have reported finding the same book on their shelves, one that was never cataloged, ordered, or recorded in any system. The book contains detailed stories of events that happened decades later, written as if they had already occurred. But whenever someone tries to borrow it, it vanishes from the library the next day. A pianist in the early 1900s claimed he had dreamed of a melody so beautiful, he woke up in tears. He rushed to write it down, believing it to be completely original. Decades later, during a trip abroad, he visited a museum displaying ancient musical manuscripts. One scroll caught his eye. It contained the exact melody he had composed years earlier. A historian researching old census data discovered a town that had supposedly existed for over 150 years. It had a documented population, businesses, and even listed newspaper articles about local events. But when he visited the location on modern maps, it was an empty field. No roads, no buildings, nothing to indicate that a town had ever been there. Older residents in nearby cities vaguely remembered hearing stories about it, but no one had ever visited. Official records continued to list it as real. An artist in the early 1900s completed a haunting painting of a funeral procession. The mourners were faceless, but one figure stood out, a man lying in a coffin, wearing a distinct suit and ring. Years later, after the artist passed away, his family was shocked to realize he had been buried in the exact same suit and ring just as he had painted it. Even the background details, including the shape of the church and the cloudy sky, perfectly matched his real funeral. A journalist in the 1950s began researching a mysterious cult that was rumored to have existed in secret for centuries. As he dug deeper, he received an anonymous letter warning him to stop. Determined, he drafted a final article exposing everything he had found. But before he could publish it, he vanished. His notes, typewriter, and even the final draft were left untouched in his office. Years later, someone found his unfinished article. A 19th century scientist spent decades designing a machine that could supposedly detect approaching danger. He claimed it could read subtle changes in the environment, a drop in temperature, a shift in air pressure before something disastrous occurred. One evening, he recorded strange fluctuations in the readings. Convinced something was wrong, he refused to leave his lab. Hours later, the building collapsed due to a sudden gas explosion. When rescuers searched the wreckage, they found his machine still intact. In a European town square, there is an old clock tower that keeps perfect time except on the same date every year. On that day, witnesses report that the clock begins ticking backward for exactly 1 hour before correcting itself. Clockmakers have inspected it, but no mechanical issues have ever been found. The town records show that a major historical event occurred on that exact date, centuries ago, one that was meant to be forgotten. An author researching folklore found a strange short story in an old archive. As he read through it, he felt an eerie sense of familiarity. The plot, the characters, even the setting were identical to a novel he was currently writing. But there was a problem. The story was dated over 50 years before he was born. It was unsigned and no records existed of the original author. A historian collecting old maps discovered something strange, a 19th century map showing a town that should have been located in a large empty field. Curious, he visited the area only to find no buildings, no ruins, and no signs of civilization. When he asked older residents, they insisted there had never been a town there. But when he dug deeper, he found a long-forgotten government document. A grand opera house, abandoned for decades, has long been rumored to be haunted. Locals claim that when the building is empty, faint music can be heard coming from the stage. A team of researchers set up recording equipment, leaving the auditorium empty overnight. The next morning, they reviewed the audio and were stunned. A full orchestra could be heard playing a symphony that no one could identify. A businessman working in a high-rise office building once stepped into an elevator and pressed his floor number as usual, but instead of stopping at his floor, the elevator took him to a level that didn't exist. When the doors opened, he found himself in a dimly lit hallway with old, faded carpeting. The space seemed abandoned, with no windows or furniture. He pressed the button frantically, and after a few seconds, the doors shut and the elevator took him back to the lobby. A small bookstore in England has long been rumored to contain books that have never been published. Customers browsing the shelves sometimes find a novel they've never heard of, by an author they don't recognize. The books contain detailed stories, but when they return later to buy them, they're gone. Even stranger, when customers ask about the books, the store owner insists they don't exist. An artist in the late 1800s painted a detailed portrait of a man he had seen in his dreams. He never sold the painting, keeping it in his studio for years. Decades later, a visitor stopped by the studio and froze when he saw the painting. It was a perfect likeness of him. But when the artist had painted it, the man hadn't even been born yet. A photographer visiting a small village in Eastern Europe noticed something unsettling. Every picture he took of the town's streets, buildings, and people looked decades older than reality. At first he thought it was a camera issue until he developed the film. Shops that were still open in real life appeared abandoned in the photos. People looked aged beyond their years, and even new cars seemed rusted and broken down. Locals claimed it had been happening for years. A retired actor was watching a classic film when he suddenly froze. He saw himself in a brief background scene walking past the main characters. The problem? He had never worked on that film. He rewound the footage, staring at his younger self, dressed in clothes he never owned, walking through a city he had never visited. His friends confirmed that it was unmistakably him. In the early 1970s, an unknown musician recorded an album that was meant to be his big break. The recording session went smoothly, and several copies of the album were pressed, but something strange happened. Within weeks, every single copy of the album vanished. The record label's files showed that it had been released, but no stores ever received it. The master tapes disappeared, the producer quit the industry abruptly, and even the musician himself couldn't find a single copy. Decades later, collectors began searching for the lost album. But to this day, not a single known copy has ever surfaced. Some believe it was erased from existence. A respected scientist in the 1930s told colleagues about a disturbing vision he had. He described being in his laboratory when an explosion suddenly engulfed the room in fire. The vision was so intense that he became paranoid, avoiding working alone and double-checking every safety measure. But despite his caution, an accident still occurred exactly as he had predicted. His lab suffered an unexpected chemical reaction, and when investigators examined the aftermath, a mystery writer in the 1950s published a novel about a robbery that took place in a small bookstore, with the culprit escaping through a hidden passage. He described the crime in extreme detail, from the method used to break into the exact amount of money stolen. A year later, the exact same crime took place in real life. Authorities were baffled. The details of the real robbery matched the book perfectly, including the secret passage that no one was supposed to know existed. A wealthy collector in the early 1900s purchased a portrait of a solemn-looking man dressed in elegant clothing. Over the years, visitors began to notice something strange. The painting seemed to change slightly, with the man's features growing older alongside its owner. At first, it was dismissed as an illusion, but when the owner passed away, the painting was examined closely. It now depicted the man with graying hair, deeper wrinkles, and a sorrowful expression matching exactly how the collector had looked before he died. A 19th century composer created a symphony with a unique structure, one that, according to his notes, could only be performed once before it became something else. When musicians attempted to play it a second time, the notes seemed to sound completely different even though they played the same sheet music. Some performers reported feeling disoriented while playing, as if they were hearing an entirely different melody than what was written. In a small European town in the 1950s, nearly every resident reported having the exact same dream on the same night. The dream was simple. A man in dark clothing walked through the town, stopping at specific houses before vanishing. When residents compared notes, they realized they had all seen the same man in the same locations. Some even claimed they had seen their own houses in the dream before waking up with the feeling that someone had stood outside their windows. No explanation was ever found. But in the following weeks, a rising Hollywood actor frequently had a nightmare about being trapped in a burning building, unable to escape. The dream was always vivid, showing the same layout, furniture, and exit doors that never opened. Years later, he was cast in a film that required him to shoot a scene inside a detailed set of an old house. The moment he stepped on set, he froze. It was exactly the place from his nightmares. The crew thought he was overreacting, but during filming, a small fire unexpectedly broke out in the set's wooden beams. An artist in the 1800s painted a breathtaking landscape of a valley with a river running through it and a strange rock formation in the background. He insisted that he had painted it from memory, though he had never traveled outside his city. Years later, explorers discovered an identical location halfway across the world. Every detail, the trees, the rock formation, even the flow of the river was exactly as he had painted it. Geologists confirmed that the landscape had been unchanged for thousands of years. A 19th century playwright created a script that baffled linguists for over a century. While most of the play was in his native language, certain sections contained entire paragraphs written in an unrecognizable script. Experts at the time dismissed it as nonsense. But decades later, archaeologists uncovered an ancient text containing symbols that matched his script exactly. The language had been extinct for over 1,000 years, yet somehow he had written sections of his play in it. A small-town radio station once received a transmission that no one had recorded. During a routine show, the signal suddenly cut out, replaced by an unknown voice reading a list of names and dates. The broadcast lasted for nearly 2 minutes before the original programming resumed. When the station checked its records, there was no trace of the interference. Even stranger, some of the names mentioned belonged to people who hadn't been born yet. In the early 2000s, a man renovating an old house discovered a sealed envelope hidden inside a wall. When he opened it, he was stunned to see that it was addressed to him by name. The letter was dated exactly 100 years before the day he found it. Inside, the message described his appearance in eerie detail, including a scar on his arm that he had never shown in photographs. There was no record of his ancestors ever living in the house, and handwriting experts confirmed that the letter was authentically written in the early 1900s. A historic museum houses a portrait of an unknown man that appears to subtly change over time. Visitors who have seen it years apart swear that his expression has shifted slightly, sometimes looking more sorrowful, other times appearing more stern. Photographic records confirm that the brushstrokes and shading have never been altered, yet the face itself seems to transform. No one knows who the man in the painting is, or why he refuses to stay the same. A playwright in the early 1900s wrote a script that has baffled directors for over a century. Actors who perform it claim that their lines seem to change during rehearsals, even though the script remains the same. During live performances, audience members recall hearing entire conversations that were never written in the original script. But when recordings of the performances are played back, those lines don't exist. A university library has long been rumored to have a single shelf where books do not stay in the same place. Librarians frequently find books moved from one section to another, sometimes rearranged into patterns that make no sense. Security cameras have never recorded anyone moving them, and the changes only happen at night when the library is closed. One librarian tried to mark the books with invisible ink to track their movement. A 19th century artist was known for painting eerie, dreamlike landscapes. One day, while staring into a river, he saw a distorted reflection of himself, not as he was, but as an old man. The vision was so vivid that he immediately went home and painted what he saw. Decades later, as he neared the end of his life, he compared his aged face to the painting and was shocked it was an exact match. The deep wrinkles, the sunken eyes, even the way his hair had grayed, everything mirrored what he had painted years before. No one could explain how he had so accurately captured his future self, but the painting remains in a private collection. A young actor once had a recurring dream where he starred in a film about a detective investigating a crime that seemed to follow him into real life. The dream was vivid, including specific dialogue and set pieces. Years later, he was invited to audition for a film, only to realize that the script was identical to his dreams. Every line, every setting, and even the character's backstory were exactly as he had envisioned them, even though the film had been written before he was born. No one on the production team had ever met him before the audition, yet the character felt as though it had been created just for him. In the 1800s, an astronomer documented a mysterious star that appeared out of nowhere in a section of the night sky where no star had been recorded before. He mapped its location, but when he tried to observe it again the next night, it was gone. Scientists dismissed his claim, assuming it had been a mistake until exactly 100 years later, another astronomer in a different country recorded the exact same star. Once again, it vanished the next night. Modern astronomers have searched the location, but no known celestial body exists there. Some believe it's a rare astronomical phenomenon. In a small university archive, there is a centuries-old book containing hundreds of handwritten names. Each name is followed by a date, but there's something disturbing about the entries. Some of the names belong to people who had not yet been born at the time the book was written. Historians initially assumed it was a coincidence, but as more records were analyzed, they realized that the book accurately listed birth dates and even death dates of individuals who wouldn't exist for decades. The pages remain unfinished, with blank spaces still left to be filled. No one knows who wrote the book, or how it contains names of people long before they entered the world. A historic theater built in the late 1800s was famous for its grand performances until a fire destroyed the main stage, forcing its permanent closure. Despite being abandoned for decades, locals began reporting faint music coming from inside the locked building after midnight. Security guards dismissed it at first, believing it was an old ventilation system, until one guard recorded the sound. It was a piano playing a melody that had never been identified. But when he played the recording back the next morning, the music was gone, replaced by silence. Even stranger, people passing by at night often see a faint light flickering from the stage, as if a performance is still happening. A world-renowned pianist in the early 1900s shocked an audience when, during a live performance, he began playing a hauntingly beautiful piece that no one recognized. His assistants and fellow musicians were confused. He had never rehearsed or written such a composition before. After the performance, critics praised the song, asking where they could find the sheet music. The pianist insisted that it didn't exist. He had simply felt the notes and played them instinctively. Decades later, a music historian found an identical composition buried in archives from the 1700s. A novelist in the 1920s wrote a chilling short story about a grand mansion that was left unfinished after the architect mysteriously vanished. The story described the mansion in detail, the layout, the number of rooms, even the peculiar spiral staircase that led to nowhere. Years later, while traveling through a rural area, the novelist took a wrong turn and stumbled upon a half-built mansion that perfectly matched the one he had imagined. The staircase, the unfinished floors, and even the missing windows were all identical to the fictional house he had created years earlier. What made it even stranger was that the house had been abandoned for decades before he had even written the story. Historians could never find records of the original architect. In the late 1970s, a folk musician wrote a haunting ballad about a man saying goodbye to the world, knowing he wouldn't live to see another day. The lyrics described a lonely figure watching the sunset, reflecting on the life he had lived. Less than a month after recording the song, the musician was found lifeless in his apartment, sitting by a window facing the sunset. Even stranger, when his family arranged his funeral, they discovered that he had already selected the same song to be the sculptor who created a lifelike statue that matched his own future appearance. A sculptor in the 1800s gained recognition for his highly detailed sculptures, but one particular piece stood out: a statue of an older man with a deeply lined face and sorrowful eyes. When asked who the statue was modeled after, he claimed he didn't know that the face had come to him in a dream. Decades later, as he aged, he began to resemble the statue more and more. When he passed away, his final photograph was placed beside the sculpture, and the resemblance was unmistakable. No one could explain how he had unknowingly sculpted his own future self. A rising Hollywood actress in the 1950s starred in a psychological thriller where her character meets a tragic fate in a very specific way. The scene, meant to be shocking, involved her character falling down a spiral staircase after being poisoned. Months after filming Wrapped, she attended an exclusive party at a luxury estate. Witnesses say that during the evening she suddenly clutched her throat as if she couldn't breathe and stumbled backward. In a chilling moment that mirrored her film, she fell down a grand staircase, just as her character had in the movie. Despite attempts to save her, she passed away before help could arrive. Autopsy reports suggested a severe allergic reaction, but friends recalled that she had never mentioned any allergies. A classical composer in the 1800s claimed that he heard music in his dreams, melodies so complex and haunting that he believed they were not from this world. When he transcribed these compositions, fellow musicians noted that the harmonies were unlike anything heard before. The strangest part? When played backward, the music contained hidden phrases and eerie sounds that resembled human voices. As his career progressed, the composer became obsessed with the idea that he was merely a messenger for something beyond human understanding. His final unfinished symphony was written in a notation system that no one has ever been able to fully decode. A playwright in the early 1900s wrote a dramatic tragedy, but every time it was performed, something terrible happened. During the first production, an actor suffered a serious accident on stage. The second performance was abruptly canceled when a fire broke out in the theater. Determined to prove the curse was just superstition, a well-known director staged a third performance in a different city. On opening night, one of the lead actors collapsed before he could deliver his first line. The play was never performed in full, and the original script was locked away. To this day, theaters that attempt to stage it experience bizarre technical failures, sudden illnesses, or unexplainable accidents. In the 1930s, a famous actress received an unsigned letter warning her that she would not live past a certain date. The letter was postmarked from a city she had never visited, and despite efforts to track the sender, no one ever came forward. She laughed it off as a cruel joke until the exact date arrived. That evening, while attending a glamorous party, she suddenly collapsed and died of unknown causes. Doctors were unable to determine the exact reason for her sudden passing, and her death certificate simply listed natural causes. Years later, historians revisiting her case discovered that another actress from the same era had received a nearly identical letter.